Summarizing educational science is extremely difficult to do in one document. All of psychology, philosophy, and related research fields should be included to form a comprehensive philosophy of practice. The reasons behind the decisions made, but Justin Sung gave it a go and recently updated his document, so I thought I would give it a read. With the first document being 44 pages and the second being 70 pages, there is some overlap, with many of the topics being repeated and expanded on, and some topics being removed. To avoid repeating myself, I'm not going to cover research that I've already done videos on, but I am going to cover some of Justin's interpretations and applications of the research. Cognitive load theory forms the base of the discussion in both documents, which I have explored before, essentially suggesting we need to optimize cognitive load. This immediately suggests to me that working memory, information processing, and the brain like a computer metaphor will be used, which I don't personally follow, so bear that in mind with my commentary. Self-explanation was brought up as a skill that helps novel problem solving. Spontaneous explanation potentially being better than prompted. But as the document is not about depth, rather breadth of topics, I'm left with a few questions. Does the explanation have to be out loud? What cues the explanation? Is there help in the explanation? What depth of understanding should the explanation go into? And lots of other similar questions that I didn't see guidance for. My guess is that during the course, which is what the document is about, Justin gets individuals to explain answers, actions, and decisions which get them thinking, increasing cognitive load and potentially enhancing learning. But I'm sure there are effective and ineffective ways of explaining something for learning. In addition, we know you don't have to explain things to learn skills, especially motor skills, because we can perform well, but not have the ability to articulate why. So yes, explanation can be helpful, but there is missing nuance for application in the document. Later, Justin discusses the illusion of fluency, where individuals can overestimate the depth of their own knowledge, and mentions the Dunning-Kruger effect, something I've discussed in depth before on the channel. But when we consider the explanations, if they use read-around knowledge because of their meta-ignorance, those explanations could be reinforcing misconceptions, which harms learning, not helps. This therefore emphasizes the importance of reflection, feedback, educator interventions and actions that again don't seem to be covered. I'm not saying that it isn't done, but those considerations for practice don't seem to be covered in the document either. There is a mention that cognitive load can be reliably measured through a subjective rating scale, which I think is an oversimplification, because cognitive load refers to intrinsic, extraneous, and germane load, which can't be measured. Mental effort is measured through scales, but that is the individual learner's perception of the effort, not including the mental load from the environment. We know when we are put in strenuous environments, our perception accuracy drastically decreases, so outside of the lab settings, the measure becomes unreliable. So mental effort can be a reliable measure in semi-controlled environments. The next idea is that working memory capacity can be trained, but the capacity is not a static number, so I don't know what would be trained. As covered in my explanation of ecological dynamics, one chunk can mean different things to different people. So what sort of capacity of working memory would be increased in training? The size of the chunks? If that is the case, surely that would be long-term memory consolidation rather than working memory capacity increase. If it is the amount of chunks, elements, or whatever term you want to use, then that will change relative to our cognitive load limit in the complexity of different information. So you could have 10 small chunks or one big chunk hitting the limit. I don't see what working memory capacity element would be trained. I love the fact Justin uses the appropriate term, retrieval practice, and not active recall here, and says it's useful, going on to discuss some elements which are supported, some of which I want to add to. Retrieval practice is more beneficial when cognitive load is higher and more demanding during retrieval, which I don't disagree with, but nuance, it can't be too high or too difficult, because then you don't remember it, understand it, or you learn to remember the answer rather than how to get to the answer. Desirable difficulty comes to mind, which is briefly discussed elsewhere in the document, just pointing it out here. Gaining correct answer feedback on high confidence correct answers can be an inefficient use of time. Again, I don't disagree, but nuance. If the feedback is more than right or wrong and goes into a deeper understanding of the topic, skill, or concept, then it can be beneficial. Also, probing for further explanation on why the answer was right can help locate misconceptions in logic, which could cause issues in related questions in the future. This goes back to rational errors from meta-ignorance and trying to locate them as an educator. I could add nuance to each point made here, but this one I think was a bit careless. In general, receiving feedback at all only has a slightly greater effect compared to no feedback, which I think drastically overlooks types, timings, and tone of feedback, not to mention the changing context for learners. Then going on to say retrieval seems to be beneficial, regardless of whether it was correct or not, which again is careless because that suggests I can try and remember something, get it completely wrong, and it be beneficial. There is no context to this point, and I think it creates misconceptions about learning rather than surfacing a topic of research. Feedback is vital in many learning contexts, so I don't think it should be thrown aside so easily. My point is emphasized by a later point talking about individuals' overwhelming inability to identify effective revision techniques. We take the easy road if presented with it. And if you say you can try and remember something and I will learn, well, then people may try and do that. I highly doubt that is the intention of the point made, but that is the interpretation that I am personally getting. So the deliberate lack of depth in the explanation could lead to misconceptions about the science. One of the reasons it is so hard to put it all in one document. Justin acknowledges that much of the research is based in laboratory settings, and the real-world application is lacking in many of the studies, which is why I personally lean towards more ecologically valid studies, but they are hard to find, especially in cognitive test tasks. Many of the other points raised in the retrieval practice and spacing section have similar nuance cases that are overlooked a bit, but the document isn't meant for depth. It was directed as an evidence base, which retrieval practice and spacing is evidenced. I just don't see the educational actions and decisions that are being made from the evidence. In other words, a lack of philosophy of practice, which you could argue is in the hypothesis shared that spaced retrieval is effective when optimizing intrinsic load, and spaced retrieval has negative effects when practicing below an intrinsic threshold. But for me, they are too broad and too shallow to help me understand how they apply the theory in practice. Inquiry-based learning is the name used for this section, but it could have so many other names, just being clear on that. The traditional learning approach outlined in the doc includes staged learning with performance tests, teachers doing most of the talking, usually with a class rather than a group, teaching via a fixed curriculum separate from individual knowledge, and lessons being done on the assumption the teacher knows best for the student. Now, I want to caveat this section by saying this sounds like it is in formal educational systems and also assumes similar contexts. For example, performance tests are not frequent in some countries. A teacher talking to a class rather than a group is vague because a class could be small and groups not needed. A fixed curriculum doesn't happen in coaching, so that point reduces the pool of context. And the last point is a bit presumptuous, as educators' self-perceptions will differ. An assumption of knowledge is valid, otherwise they wouldn't be educating, and what is best for the learners is unknown and can't really be known because you can't go back in time to learn it again. I recognise the point is about do what the teacher says, but that isn't always about learning. It could be about control of the environment, which is a whole other conversation. In inquiry-based learning, there is problem solving, or testing of hypothesis, evaluating findings, and learners creating explanations based on evidence which is communicated in some form. Which again I think is quite vague. In math, students are given loads of questions to solve, but I don't think that is what is meant as inquiry-based learning. In science, lots of experiments are done. Testing hypothesis and explanations are asked for, but from my understanding, it is the generation and reasons behind those explanations that makes the difference, not just the explanation. When considering the communication of how they communicate it, what depth, who to, what trigger, I feel like there needs to be more than the points shared for someone to put this theory into practice. Supporting my point is the comment about barriers to teacher training implementing inquiry-based learning. They require training and deeper understanding of what it means, what it looks like, how to do it, with more nuance. I do want to reinforce again, this document is about breadth, not depth, so it is understandable the nuance isn't raised. Again, alluding to the difficulty of putting all of this in one document. Note-taking is a topic I am very familiar with, but was surprised this section didn't mention extended cognition or any of the four E's, as that to me would be a logical way to connect cognitive load theory and note-taking. Note-taking serves as a storage of information, extended cognition, and can induce deeper processing, whatever that means, for learning. I think a fairly obvious point is made and reinforced nicely, saying that note-taking is individual, and top students' methods might be ineffective for bottom students. Although I don't totally agree, I think the skill of note-taking is something developed over time which changes how people learn. There is no one method, best method, or go-to method apart from the one that works and helps the individual at that point in time in that context. The typed V longhand note-taking discussion was covered, getting to the same conclusion I did in that there is no significant difference. Therefore concluding that note-taking, which creates sufficient, tolerable cognitive load while preventing cognitive overload, produces the best performance. Essentially saying, take notes you understand and understand in the future. In short, the suggested system is to identify highlightable points, keywords and points, group similar points, or related points, express the relations in some way, visualization is suggested using things like arrows or doodles, and then repeat the process, separating elements for space retrieval or rote memorization. All of this to me sounds like our natural learning process. Sense information, pay attention to important bits, remember important bits, maybe with the help of something, then try and understand it, making connections for deeper understanding, then practice to get better. I think the natural learning process underpins most frameworks. They just differ in nuanced applications at different points, which to me are individual preferences we develop during practice. In the second document, the updated document, the emphasis is on points for discussion, which is what I have based the previous commentary on. I started scripting this video before the second doc was released, so here are the added bits that stuck out to me. Higher order learning skills suggest an order of thinking skills, something I seriously disagree with, but Justin goes on to discuss how higher order learning can be applied and how it can help learning. The point is raised that higher order skills, like comparing ideas against each other, identifying relationships, prioritizing and making judgments on the relationships, considering the purpose of information, is better than simply understanding isolated concepts. But what I see here is not an order of skills from a hierarchy of thinking. Lower order learning, if memorizing a concept, definition, terminology, or facts, don't serve as a foundation for higher order skills. They are part of those skills. He argues higher order skills require focus with purpose and attention to context, but the same can be said for remembering things, or any other lower order skill. The Bloom's taxonomy is referenced and used, but the taxonomy is outdated and should be retired, as this article expresses quite nicely. Thinking does not operate within hierarchies, but in a plethora of configurations. This is the evolution of the taxonomy over time, and Justin does reference a more recent paper, but it still shows the same as the 2001 paper referenced here. The terms used in the taxonomy are not validated terms, but broad overarching words that can mean a variety of different things from cognitive science. Understanding is an ongoing epistemological debate with varying degrees of depth and meaning. Knowledge or remembering has no unified definition, again with varying implications in the thinking process, with various types of knowledge that you could consciously or unconsciously remember and use in thinking. One example from this paper is when you encounter a problematic situation and you analyze how to deal with it, evaluating potential solutions, but then retrospectively analyzing and checking the solutions, again going back and forth. The processes are mutually dependent. No analysis without prior evaluation, no evaluation without prior analysis. Then how can creation be a high order skill when we can create using guesses and assumptions with limited research? How would you determine the value of creation? In a similar sense, how can we comprehend, remember, or understand something without evaluation of information from past experiences? Our reasoning comes from experience. Bloom's taxonomy also tells us nothing about the acquisition, creation of knowledge, how the learner's intellectual values, psychological effects of learning experiences, individual differences in cognitive processing, or communicative processes involved in research impact development. It says nothing about collaboratively creating, managing, or modifying knowledge either. The notion that learning can be assessed by a tick box, which is part of the hierarchy you got to, seems absurd. What about assessing the quality of the reasoning? Rational errors, misconceptions, and bias are real things. In the closing lines of this paper, they bring up autonomy, competence, and relatedness for the learner as a topic not covered by the taxonomy. Real-life contexts and their relevance for knowledge creation also not considered. It doesn't consider the role of prior knowledge at all. There is no sensible assessment for learning, and we know thinking is not a strict sequence of processes as it depends on the problem complexity, which Justin acknowledges when he discusses cognitive load theory. Is the hierarchy one possible path? Yes, but it doesn't cover any of the other dynamic ways in which we think. So to me, it is outdated, and the higher order thinking are not higher order at all. They're just parts of the learning process. Active inference, the Bayesian brain hypothesis, and related information processing theories are all directions to look at if that is the paradigm of thought you lean towards. I personally lean towards ecological dynamics and ecological psychology, like I mentioned earlier, but I've said my piece. Back to Justin's document, an extension to the mental effort cognitive load point from earlier, Justin discusses the misinterpreted effort hypothesis, where more effort is perceived as poor learning, which I'm not entirely sold on. I think it's more likely they don't want to put effort in, but they both could lead to less effective strategies being used. This relates to a paper I recently reviewed about efficiency, but as it mentions, interpretations are difficult to call accurate. And we all want to be efficient, but we need to recognize we will be inefficient and bad at the start. To me, this links to motivation, failure perception, and the individual's goals behind the skill, concept, or idea that they are trying to learn. Learn to pass a test. Learn until you get bored, or whatever it is. Learn for mastery. There is more to talk about than just the interpretation of effort, but again, the document is for breadth, not depth. The conversation does go on in some different directions, metacognition and the like, but lands on flashcards being seen as beneficial when often they are not. The way I see this research is that flashcards are a great tool for certain contexts. It is the misattribution of the learning technique to the context that is the issue, not the technique itself, which to me is down to the educators to help with. Those of you at this point in the video as self-directed learners can probably recognize flashcards won't help you learn a motor skill, but will help you learn country flag names. So use the technique in an appropriate context. The question I then ask is, how do you match techniques with a context? Which will fall back to the philosophy of practice for the educator or learner, applying theory to practice. So different philosophies have different solutions, meaning there is no one or right answer. Expanding on the motivation points I have brought up, it is mentioned as an influencing factor in student ability to self-regulate their learning, which suggests motivation should be a section explored somewhere in the document, but unfortunately, not this time. Briefly on that note or topic, a changelog of this document would be really nice for the future, so I don't have to read over the same point again and again. Thanks, Justin. But my main takeaways, despite the somewhat critiquing style of video, is positive. Lots of educational science literature is used and referenced, something most others don't seem to do. An approach to theory in practice was discussed and applied, which I deliberately didn't want to comment too much on to keep things about the science and not the business bits. And having spoken with Justin, I know there is logic and reason behind many of the points raised, but due to the limitation of words, pages, or the fact that humans are complex, the depth of points were lacking in nuance and context, which, as I stated at the start, is very difficult to put in one document. This is a great starting point for a conversation, and if you have the time, it is certainly worth a read. I personally don't have a document of my own, but I put all of my research freely accessible online in my notes, which evolves over time just like our understanding, but feel free to browse around and ask questions in the comment section below.